Hi there and welcome to this video where I'm going to show you how to use the Drift Synth in Ableton Live. This video is actually a section taken from my complete Ableton Live course. If you'd like full access to this complete course, then be sure to check out the link in the description below. Okay, so let's get started with this video. Okay, so now let's talk about the Drift Synth, which was introduced in Ableton Live 11.3. This synth is also available for all editions of Ableton Live 11, including Suite, Standard, Intro and Lite. The Drift Synth is designed to behave like an old analog synth. With this analog style subtractive synth, you can make certain parameters drift in and out of phase, including the oscillators, the tuning and the filters. So this synth allows you to replicate the imperfections and drift of analog synthesizers. This can give you an analog vintage feel when using this synth. The Drift Synth isn't based on one particular analog synth, but it has some unique features and an easy to use interface. Ableton Live also has another analog synth, which is called Analog, but this is only available in Ableton Live Suite. Both of these synths work with simple waveform shapes, but Drift does seem simpler to use than Analog, and Drift also has a unique drifting feature. When we use the drifting feature, we will have some waves playing almost at the same time with some drifting elements, which allows you to create thicker sounds, as this allows you to create layers in your sound without layering the instruments. I'll be covering this in detail soon enough though in this section. Drift also has a modulation matrix, which is a lot simpler to use than say Wavetable Synth's modulation matrix, and again the Wavetable Synth is only available in Ableton Live Suite, and Drift is available in all editions of Ableton Live. The Drift Synth does look quite simple when you first look at it, but it does give you a lot of different possibilities and options in terms of sound design, which I'll be covering in detail in this section. Okay, so that's an introduction to this Drift Synth. Next, I'll be giving you a brief overview of the synth before we dive deep into all the different functions and features of this synth. Okay, so now let's have a quick overview of this Drift Synth, and then I'll go through all the sections of this synth in detail while showing you musical examples. So, Drift signal flow goes from left to right, just like all the other Ableton Live instruments. Drift has a very minimal user interface, but starting off we have the oscillators. We have two oscillators and noise, and we can choose the wave shape for these two oscillators. I'm just going to choose a few of the different wave shapes for oscillator 1 and then play a chord so you can hear the difference. Let's also add some noise here with this dial so you can hear the noise. And let's just dial it back. And let's just drag this all the way back to the left so the noise is off. Then we have one low pass filter, which we can use for cutting out some of the high frequencies. Let's just double click to go back to default. We also have a high pass filter for cutting out some of the low frequencies. Then we have two ADSR envelopes. With envelope 2, you can set it to loop, which allows you to create rhythmic shapes. So it can sound more like a looping envelope or an LFO. So you can set envelope 2 to modulate certain parameters. I'll be showing you this in detail later on, but just for this quick example, let's modulate the pitch with envelope 2. So you can see here in the pitch modulation, it's set to the default of envelope 2. Let's just increase this percentage dial here and play back some notes. Then you should be able to hear this looping envelope modulate the pitch. And again, let's go back to default of 0% by double clicking. Then we have the LFO or low frequency oscillator section. We can also set the LFO to modulate certain parameters. I will be showing you this in detail later on, but just for this quick example, let's modulate the pitch again, but this time with the LFO. If we go over to the pitch modulation area here, you can see we already have LFO selected here. So let's just add some percentage here now and play this back. And if we change the rate of the LFO, you can hear it's a lot faster. Like I said, I'll be going over this in detail later on. But again, let's put this back to 0% by double clicking. We also have this Modulation Matrix tab here, which gives you more modulation options. And again, I'll be showing you this later on. We then have the Voices section, so we can choose how many voices and what mode, including poly, mono, stereo, and unison. We then have the Drift control, which allows us to drift certain parameters out of phase to give us that analog or vintage synth feel. I'm just going to play a chord now and then adjust this drift parameter, so you should be able to hear the difference. So right now this may be quite subtle, but when we adjust some more parameters of the synth later on, you should be able to hear this drift in and out of phase a bit more. Then we have a few more parameters in this voices section, but again, I'll be covering all of this in detail later on. Okay, so that's a really brief overview of the synth. Next, I'm going to talk about the oscillator section in detail, and then talk about all the other sections of this synth after this. Okay, so now let's have a look at the oscillator section and the drift control. So here we have two oscillators, and these are used to generate waveforms. So you can choose the basic tone and color of the sound by choosing the wave shape that you select for the oscillators. By default, oscillator 1 is a saw wave, and oscillator 2 is a sine wave. So when we play this back, you can hear it gives us a classic synth tone. We can also choose other wave shapes for these oscillators, which will change the basic sound of the synth. So we can do this by clicking on the drop-down arrow here. For this example though, I'm just going to turn off oscillator 2 and just listen to oscillator 1 so we can clearly hear the different wave shapes. We can turn off oscillator 2 by clicking on this 2 button here, and you'll note it's disabled because it's not lit up anymore. Okay, so now let's hear some of these different wave shapes. We have the regular waveforms that you'd be used to, for example sine, and sawtooth, and triangle, and also square. We also have these other waveform shapes as well, and you'll notice they all produce a different sound. But again, let's put this back to the default, which is sawtooth. Next to the wave shape control, we have an octave dial. By default, oscillator 1 will be on 0, but we can change the octave down by up to 2 octaves and up by up to 3 octaves. Again though, let's go back to default by double clicking. Oscillator 2 is a little different. By default, it is set up as a sub-oscillator. This is because the octave is set to -1. Let's turn on oscillator 2 again by pressing the 2 button, and you can see that it lights up again, which means it's enabled. We actually have fewer wave shapes for oscillator 2, but we have all the classic ones of sine, triangle, sawtooth, and square, and one of the more unusual shapes too. With oscillator 2, we can change the octave down up to 3 octaves and up to 2 octaves. So down 1 octave more or up 1 octave less than oscillator 1. As I said, it's designed as a sub-oscillator by default, but you can set this higher or the same octave as oscillator 1 if you wish. It's really up to you. But again, let's put this back to default by double clicking. You'll also notice that oscillator 1 has this shape control here, which we don't have for oscillator 2. So let's now talk about this shape control for oscillator 1. This shape control will change the shape of the waveform, but it will change the shape differently depending on the waveform that you have selected. Again, let's just disable oscillator 2 so we can hear oscillator 1 a bit clearer. And I'm going to play a few of these different waveforms now and adjust this shape control, and you should be able to hear that the shape control will adjust the shape differently depending on what waveform. We can also see that the shape updates in the display down here when we adjust this shape control. Let's now play this back again with oscillator 2 and adjust the shape dial for oscillator 1, so we can hear these oscillators together. Let's now jump ahead to this drift dial over here, as this is really what makes this drift synth unique. I'm just going to play this back and adjust the drift parameter here, and you should be able to hear changes to the pitch, and the oscillator will drift in and out of phase. Okay, so you can quickly hear how just changing the waveform, shape dial, and drift dial can quickly change the sound of this synth. Another thing to mention is that oscillator 2 has a detune dial, and oscillator 1 doesn't have this control. So with this detune dial, we can detune oscillator 2 up or down up to 7 semitones. So we can detune this subtly, or we can detune this all the way up or down 7 semitones or a fifth. Let me show you this now with some subtle detuning. Before I do this though, I'm just going to set drift back to default, as this will change the pitch slightly. Let's now use the detune dial to transpose oscillator 2 to another note. So you can use this detune dial to subtly detune oscillator 2, or you can use it to change the pitch to another note. Then we have this noise oscillator here, so you can add some noise to your sound by increasing this dial here. This noise control is a little limited as we can only adjust the gain, we can't choose the sound of the noise, like in some other synths such as the third-party synthesizer Serum, but this noise oscillator still may be useful for you if you want to add a bit of noise to the sound. But if you don't want to use this noise oscillator, then you can turn it off by turning it all the way down, or you can press this end button here to disable it. We also have this right arrow button here next to the noise and the 2 oscillators, and this will send them to the filter. So if you don't want them to get sent to the filter, you will need to select this arrow button here so the color isn't solid. One more thing to mention is the level for the oscillators. So you can turn them up or down with these gain dials here. These gain dials will actually behave a little differently from just turning the volume up or down. High gain values cause the filter to sound a bit warmer, especially when there are high resonance values. This is to recreate the behaviors found in analog circuits. That's because this drift synth is trying to emulate an old analog synth. So just bear that in mind, higher gain values will change the filter sound a little. Okay, so that's the end of this part 1 video. Next we're going to look at the oscillator shape modulation and the oscillator pitch modulation. By the way, this video is actually a section taken from my complete Ableton Live course. If you'd like to learn even more about synthesis and music production in Ableton Live, then be sure to check out my complete course via the link in the description below. Okay, so let's get back to this video. Okay, so now let's have a look at the oscillator shape modulation and the pitch modulation source area down here. Let's first have a look at the oscillator shape modulation. In this drop-down list here, we can choose a modulation source to modulate the shape parameter in oscillator 1, and we can choose the amount with this percentage control here. I'll start off by choosing an LFO as this is an easy one to hear. Then after this, I'll explain the other modulation sources. Let's now increase this percentage slider here, and I'll play a chord. So as LFO will be modulating or moving the shape dial at a rate we select here in the LFO section. Let's now increase the rate of this LFO and play this back again. So you can hear there when we increase the rate, it was modulating the shape dial a lot faster. If this is at 0% though, we won't hear any of this modulation. Okay, let's now have a look at some of the other modulation sources. Let's choose this first one, envelope 1. So now we're using envelope 1 as the modulation source. So this is the ADSR envelope over here. So the shape of this envelope will modulate the shape of the oscillator. Let's just increase the percentage amount here and play this back. And if I set this back to 0%, you should be able to hear the difference. Just be aware though, I will be explaining all the other sections of this synthesizer a bit later on, so if you're new to ADSR envelopes, don't worry, I'll explain this soon enough. Okay, so we can also choose envelope 2 as the modulation source. This again is an ADSR envelope, and we can cycle this envelope so it sounds like an LFO by selecting this button here. Let's just increase the percentage now and hear this back. Like the LFO, we can increase the rate. I will be explaining the envelope section in detail in one of the next few videos, so again, don't worry if you're not too sure about some of these controls, I will be explaining them soon enough. Okay, so then we have the LFO, which we've already talked about. Then we have key, which is for the notes that are pressed or played. Then we have velocity, so the velocity of the notes will adjust the shape of the oscillator. So you'll notice that when I play soft, the shape will sound different than when I play hard. So I'm going to play soft now, and I'm going to play the same chord but hard. So again, I'll play soft and then hard. So there, the velocity of the MIDI notes that I was playing while modulating the oscillator shape. This is also the same for if you draw in some MIDI notes. So I'm just going to draw in some notes now. And I'm going to have different velocity amounts. So the first one will have a low velocity, the second one will have a high velocity. So there, the MIDI velocity was also modulating the oscillator shape. Okay, let's go back to the synth. Then we have mod wheel, so if your MIDI device has a mod wheel, you can move this to adjust the oscillator shape. Then we have pressure and slide, which can only be used if you have an MPE or MIDI polyphonic expression controller, such as the push-to or Rolly. So pressure is the aftertouch of the notes on an MPE controller, so the pressure of this note can be used to modulate the oscillator shape. Then slide, which is the vertical movement pressure of the key or button on the MPE controller, which again can be used to modulate the oscillator shape. By the way, we can also use negative values as well as positive values, which will modulate in the opposite direction. But for this though, let's just put this back to 0% and then talk about the pitch modulation source area down here. With this, we can modulate the pitch of the oscillators. We can select up to 2 modulation sources, so we can have 2 modulation sources modulate the pitch of the oscillators if we wish. These are the same controls that we just looked at, but for this example, let's increase envelope 2, and you'll notice that this cycling envelope will modulate the pitch of the oscillators. At 100% it will be quite extreme, but let's hear this back. Let's dial this back to something a bit more usable, and let's hear this back. Let's now increase the percentage for the LFO, so now the LFO will modulate the pitch of the oscillators at the rate we select here. So we do have 2 modulation sources here, so let's now increase the percentage for envelope 2, so now envelope 2 and the LFO will be modulating the pitch of the oscillator. Okay, so as you can hear there are a lot of different modulation possibilities just in this oscillator section. So I do recommend testing this out and experimenting with these modulation sources. Okay, so that's the end of this video. Next we're going to have a look at the filter section. Okay, so next we have the filter section. As I said before, if we send the oscillator or noise to the filters, then these arrow buttons need to be enabled. So for now they're enabled, so they're all being sent to the filter. We can see they're enabled because the arrow button is solid, not hollow. So our main filter is a low pass filter. This means it'll allow us to cut out the high frequencies and allows the low frequencies to pass. We can set where we want our filters to cut from with this frequency dial here. If we're using filter type 1, then the frequencies will be cut at the frequency cutoff point at a 12 dB per octave slope. So when we move this frequency dial, we can see the area that we're cutting or filtering. If we swap this over to filter type 2, then the frequencies will be cut at the filter cutoff point at a 24 dB per octave slope. So filter type 2 will have a steeper slope than filter type 1. Before I play any examples back though, I'm just going to set the pitch modulation back to 0% for envelope 2 and the LFO. So you can see if we use filter type 2, then the slope will be steeper and will cut the frequencies more suddenly from the filter cutoff point. We also have a resonance control, and this allows us to add a boost before the cutoff filter point. Having some resonance can be useful to emphasize the cutoff frequency by boosting at the filter cutoff point. High resonance amounts are also very noticeable when sweeping the filter frequency. Let me show you now. You can also automate this too as an effect if you desire. We can also click and drag on this solid yellow circle in the display to adjust the filter cutoff point and resonance rather than using the dials if you wish. We also have another filter, which is a high pass filter. With this, we can cut the low frequencies and allow the high frequencies to pass. We do have fewer settings for this high pass filter though. We can only adjust the cutoff frequency with this dial. For now though, I'm just going to set the high pass filter back to default. Okay, now let's talk about this key control. This allows us to have different amounts of filter modulation for the different pitches of MIDI notes. At the default of 0, the pitch of the MIDI note won't affect the filter frequency. But if I put this to 1, then the filter frequency will be lower for low pitched notes and will be higher for high pitched notes. Let me show you now. So when it's on 1, it's modulating the filter based on what MIDI note is played. By the way, we can't use negative amounts for this control, so we can't flip the settings, we can only use positive amounts. Okay, so that's the end of this part 1 video. Next we're going to look at this filter modulation area down here. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Let's now have a look at the frequency modulation area for the filter. With this, we can set a modulation source to modulate the filter cutoff point for the low pass filter. We have 2 modulation sources that we can have active here if we wish. It's the same modulation sources that we looked at in the oscillator video, but I'll go over these again quickly in case you missed that one or as a refresher. So there are a few different modulation sources here that we can choose. Let's first of all choose envelope 1, which is this ADSR volume envelope here. So the shape of this envelope will affect the volume, but we can also use it as a modulation source to modulate the filter cutoff as well if we wish. For this example, let's just drag down the filter frequency so it's a bit easier to hear. Let's now increase this percentage slider and play a chord. Now I'm going to increase the attack time, and you should be able to hear now that the volume will gradually fade in, but it will also modulate the filter frequency cutoff for the low pass filter. Let's just put the attack back to default. As I said, envelope 1 is also the volume envelope, so if you want to use an envelope to modulate the filter cutoff, and you want this to be independent from the volume envelope, then I recommend selecting envelope 2 as the modulation source. I'm just going to disable cycling for now, and let's increase the attack. And you should be able to hear that envelope 2 is modulating the filter frequency and is independent to envelope 1, which is the volume envelope. Let's just enable cycling mode again by pressing this button, and now you'll notice that envelope 2 sounds more like an LFO, where it's repeating the envelope. Let's just adjust the rate and play this back again. Let's now look at the next modulation source, which is LFO. So the LFO will modulate the filter cutoff for the low pass filter at the rate we select here in the LFO section. Okay, then we have a few more modulation sources, including key. Key means the notes that are played or pressed. Then we have velocity. So if I play some notes back now at different MIDI velocities, so let's now play a chord gently, and then play it hard. The lower velocity values will have a lower filter frequency cutoff point, and higher velocity values will have a higher filter frequency cutoff point. However, if we set this to -100%, then it will do the opposite. So lower velocities will open up the filter, and higher velocities will pull back the filter. So let me show you now. So I'm going to play a chord softly, and then I'm going to play the same chord hard. So you should notice there when I play the chord hard, so with higher MIDI velocities, the filter frequency was a lot higher than when I played the chord softly with low MIDI velocities. Okay, then we have mod wheel. So if you have a mod wheel on your MIDI controller, then you can use this to modulate the filter's cutoff. If you don't have a mod wheel on your MIDI keyboard though, then this won't do anything. Then we have pressure and slide, which you can only use if you have an MPE or MIDI polyphonic expression ready controller, such as the Rolly or Push 2. Pressure is the aftertouch of the note on an MPE controller. Then slide, which is the vertical movement pressure of the key or button on the MPE controller. So if you have an MPE controller, then you can test this out. If you don't have one though, then these won't do anything. Remember, you do have 2 of these modulation sources, so you can use both of them at the same time if you wish. So just for this example, let's choose envelope 2 and LFO, and I'm going to increase the percentages for both of these. I'm also going to disable the cycling mode for envelope 2, and then adjust the attack control. So now when I play this back, envelope 2 and the LFO will modulate the filter frequency cutoff point for this low pass filter. Let me show you now. I'm just going to play this back again, but this time let's increase the filter frequency And I'm also going to adjust the attack time for envelope 2. So as you can hear, we can create some interesting effects by using this frequency modulation section for this filter frequency. I will be looking at the envelope in the next few videos, and then I will be looking at the LFO after that. So don't worry if you're new to synthesis, I will be explaining the envelope and LFO in more detail soon enough. Okay, so that's this filter frequency modulation area. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Okay, so now let's have a look at the envelope section, which is this area over here. We've looked at the envelopes already when using them as a modulation source, but I'll explain them again in more detail. So here we have two ADSR envelopes. Envelope 1 is a volume envelope, so this will affect the volume of the instrument. I'll just move a few of these settings now, and you should be able to hear its effect in the sound. But before I do this though, I'm just going to reset the frequency modulation for the filter frequency cutoff point that we set in the last video. Let's also increase the filter frequency cutoff point so we can hear the notes a bit clearer. Okay, so now I'm going to play a chord and then adjust some of the settings for this volume envelope. Don't worry, I will be explaining all of these settings soon enough. So you should have heard there that when I adjusted the attack, decay, sustain and release, it affected the volume envelope. We can also use envelope 1 as a modulation source, as well as a volume envelope 2 if we wish. Envelope 2 isn't a volume envelope though, so if I move some of these settings, then you won't hear a difference at the moment. This is because envelope 2 needs to be assigned as a modulation source to be able to hear a difference. Envelope 2 is also independent to envelope 1, so if we change some of the settings on envelope 2, then it won't affect the volume envelope. So we have these 4 settings for these 2 envelopes: attack, decay, sustain and release. So that is what ADSR stands for. I'll just explain what these do now, just in case you're new to synthesis or as a quick refresher. Let's explain this on envelope 1. So firstly we have attack, and this is the time it takes for the sound to go from silence to the maximum level. This is measured in milliseconds, and a very fast attack time means that we can hear the sound of the instrument almost instantly as soon as we trigger the MIDI or play back the note. We can also set this to 0 milliseconds, so we can hear the sound instantly as soon as the MIDI is triggered. As I increase this, you'll hear it ramp up and the sound fades in when I trigger the notes. With even longer attack times, you can hear the sound will slowly build up. We can see the graph display update when we adjust this attack time. We can also click and drag on this yellow square to adjust the attack time. So you could use a fast attack time if you want a more percussive sound, so maybe a pluck sound. And you could use a longer attack time for maybe pads or a lush string sound. Let's now talk about the decay dial. So decay is the time it takes for the peak or maximum level to fall to the sustain level. This again is in milliseconds and seconds. If we adjust the yellow square, then this will adjust the decay and the sustain level. Let's now talk about the sustain level. So the sustain level allows us to choose the volume of the note whilst it's being held. This is in percentages, so we could choose anywhere from 0% to 100%. 100% will hold the peak level until the note is let go. For this example though, let's put the attack back to default. And 0% will fall to silence after the attack time and decay time. Or we can have anywhere in between. So with the attack, we could hear the volume of the note gradually increase to the peak level, and the decay is the time it takes to fall to the sustain level. And the sustain level is the volume of the note whilst it's being held, and then when we let go of the note, it will fade to silence. And we can set the fade out time with the release time, which again is in milliseconds and seconds. So with a longer release time, it'll take longer for the sound to fade out to silence once the MIDI note has been let go. And with a much shorter release time, it'll fade to silence much faster. Or we can choose anywhere in between. Okay, so that's the basics of an ADSR envelope. and this allows you to change the sound of your instrument. So you can create fast percussive sounds with shorter settings. So this might be useful for pluck sounds or an arpeggiated part. So let's create some fast settings now. Or for long held notes, you may wish to have higher settings. So this may be more useful for pads or held string sounds. Okay, so that's the end of this part 1 video. I'll see you in part 2, where we're going to be looking at envelope 2 and the cycling mode. Okay, so now let's talk about envelope 2 a little more. As I said, this can be assigned as a modulation source. So just for this example, let's assign this to modulate the shape of the oscillator. So in the oscillator shape modulation area here, let's select envelope 2 and increase this percentage amount. We also have this cycling button for envelope 2. If we enable this, then it will cycle the envelope and will sound a bit like an LFO. Before I do this though, I'm just going to put envelope 1 or the volume envelope settings back to default. Okay, let's now hear envelope 2 with the cycling button enabled as a modulation source. So we do have a few controls for this cycling envelope. The first one is tilt, which tilts the shape left and right. So it allows you to move the midpoint of the envelope to the left or to the right. You can also see that this affects the slopes of the envelope and can change the sound. You also don't have a tilt control on a standard LFO, and we don't have a tilt control on this LFO here, so this control makes the cycling envelope quite unique. Okay, next we have this hold setting, and this allows us to choose how long these cycling envelopes will stay at the maximum level. This again will change the shape and the sound of these cycling envelopes. Then we have the rate. By default, this will be in Hertz, which is a frequency-based rate. We can also set the rate of the cycling envelope to time. This again will be in milliseconds and seconds. We can also sync this to the project's tempo with this time mode. With this, we can choose musical beat divisions or bars. Then we have this one-to-one time mode. This time mode is based on the pitch of the oscillator, and this mode can give us some interesting results. Let me show you now. But for now, let's put this back to the default of Hertz. Again, we can turn off the cycling mode if you wish, and just use this as a regular ADSR envelope as a modulation source. But for now, I'll leave this enabled. Okay, so that's envelope 2 and the cycling mode. Let's just put this modulation source for the oscillator shape back to 0%, and next we're going to look at the LFO section. Okay, so now let's have a look at the LFO section. LFO stands for low frequency oscillator, and these are sound waves that are very low, actually lower than what we can hear. So we can't hear these sound waves, but we use the LFO to modulate other parameters. By default though, we can't hear this LFO modulate anything, we will need to set it up. For this example, let's use the LFO as a modulation source to modulate the pitch of the oscillators. So in the pitch modulation area down here in the oscillator section, let's make sure LFO is selected and increase the percentage amount. Now you'll hear that the LFO is modulating the pitch of the oscillator at the rate we select here in the LFO section. For the LFO, we have the same time modes that we just looked at for envelope 2, but I'll go over them again really quick just in case you missed that video. So by default, this will be in Hertz, which is a frequency-based rate. Then we can choose milliseconds and seconds. Or we can sync this to the tempo of the project and choose musical beat divisions or bars. Then we have this 1-to-1 time mode, which will be based on the pitch of the oscillator. And this mode can create some interesting effects. For now though, let's put this back to the default of Hertz. We can also choose different wave shapes for this LFO. We have a lot of common shapes such as sine, triangle, saw up, saw down, and square. Then we have a few less common shapes, such as sample and hold, which will give us a much more random sound. Then we have wander, which is similar to sample and hold, but the wave is smoothed out. Then we have the linear and exponential envelopes. This turns the LFO into an envelope, kind of opposite of what we did in the cycling mode for envelope 2. With linear and exponential, you notice it will not repeat, whereas the other waveform shapes will repeat. We also have this R button next to the waveform, and this is the retrigger button. If this is enabled, then it means every new MIDI note will retrigger the LFO. For this example, let's put this back to the sine wave. If I have retrigger disabled, then you'll notice it doesn't retrigger when I play a new note, it continues to cycle through the wave shape. Let's just slow the rate down so it's more obvious to hear. Then with retrigger enabled, you'll notice it's retriggering the LFO each time. Okay, then down below we have the amount, so we can adjust the amount of LFO modulation. This also updates in the display when we adjust this control. Okay, then we can choose a modulation source to modulate the LFO amount. So this LFO amount dial can be modulated. It's the same modulation controls that we looked at before, but just for this example, let's choose envelope 2. Let's now increase this to 100%, and you should be able to hear that envelope 2 is modulating the LFO amount dial. We can also use negative percentage amounts, which will inverse the modulation. So we can create some interesting sounds with this modulation control for the LFO amount. But now let's put this modulation source back to 0%, so envelope 2 will no longer be modulating the LFO amount. We actually have more modulation controls in the Modulation Matrix tab here, which we'll be looking at in the next video. Okay, so now let's have a look at this Modulation tab. Here in this tab, we have even more modulation options. Here we have a full modulation matrix. So we can choose 3 different modulation sources and modulation destinations. And all 3 of these have the same modulation sources and destinations for us to choose from. So we could have all 3 modulating at the same time, or we could have 2 or 1, or none of them modulating. These all work in the same way as the modulation areas that we looked at before. So it's the same modulation sources that we saw earlier. So envelope 1 and 2, LFO, key, velocity, mod wheel, and the 2 MPE modulation sources, pressure and slide. But this time there are a lot more destinations for us to modulate. I'll quickly go through each of these different destinations now. Before I show an example though, I'm just going to reset the modulation that we set up in the previous video. So down here in the pitch modulation, I'm just going to reset LFO back to 0%. Okay, so now our sound has no modulation set up. So let's now set up some modulation in this Modulation tab. So for this example, let's use envelope 2 as the modulation source, and I'm also going to make sure cycling mode is enabled. Okay, so let's now have a look at these different modulation destinations. By the way, if you have none selected, then this won't modulate anything, and there will be no change to the sound when we adjust the percentage amount. Okay, so let's now have a look at main volume as the modulation destination, as this will be an easy one to hear. So this will modulate the volume dial over here, so it's the master volume for the synth. Okay, so now let's have a look at oscillator 1 gain. So now envelope 2 will modulate the gain of oscillator 1, so the dial over here. Then we have oscillator 1 shape, so basically the same modulation shape control that we looked at earlier. So now this will modulate the shape dial here. Then we have oscillator 2 gain, so this will modulate the gain for oscillator 2. Then we have oscillator 2 detune, so this one will modulate the detune dial for oscillator 2. I think modulating the detune dial can sound pretty cool. Okay, then we have noise gain. Let's just turn up the gain of the noise oscillator so we can hear this. Okay, let's turn the noise oscillator back down and have a look at the next one. Next we have the low pass filter frequency. So this will modulate the frequency dial for the low pass filter. Let's just turn this frequency dial back and hear this. Okay, then we have the low pass resonance. So now envelope 2 will modulate this resonance control for the low pass filter. Let's just increase the filter frequency and hear this back. Let's also turn off the cycling mode for envelope 2 and listen to this envelope modulate the low pass resonance. I think this one sounds quite interesting as a non-cycling or non-looping envelope. But for now though, let's enable cycling again, and I'm also going to set the low pass filter frequency back to default. Okay, so now let's have a look at the next one, which is high pass frequency. So now envelope 2 will modulate the frequency for the high pass filter. Okay, then we have LFO rate. So for this, let's use the LFO as a modulation source, or we won't be able to hear this do anything. Just so it's really obvious, let's have the LFO modulate the pitch of the oscillators. So for the pitch modulation source over here, let's make sure we have LFO selected and increase the percentage amount. Now in the modulation matrix, if I change this back to 0%, you'll notice that the LFO is different from when it's at 100%. That's because envelope 2 now is modulating the LFO rate. Let's put this back to 100% and I'm going to turn off the cycling mode for envelope 2 and you should hear that this will also sound different. So as you could hear, this does give us a few different possibilities. But for now, let's put the LFO back down to 0% in the pitch modulation area and have a look at the next modulation destination in this modulation matrix. The next one is cycling envelope rate. Let me just enable the cycling mode for envelope 2. So this destination is envelope 2 cycling rate. Depending on what time mode you have selected, this might be for time, sync, ratio, or rate. To hear some changes though, we need to use envelope 2 as a modulation source. So let's have this for the next modulation source below. And let's have it modulating the master volume so it's an easy one to hear. So let's now increase the percentage here, and you should be able to hear that envelope 2 is modulating the master volume. For the first modulator, let's actually change this to an LFO. So now the LFO will modulate the cycling envelope rate, and we can also hear that envelope 2 is being used as a modulation source to modulate the main volume. And then we have the main volume, which we've already looked at. Okay, so that's all the different modulation destinations. We've looked at all the different modulation sources already, but let's actually add something to the third modulator down here, just so we can have all three going at the same time. Now let's use envelope 1 or the volume envelope as a modulation source, and let's have this modulating oscillator 2's detune dial. So let's add some percentage here and hear this back. Let's now use some lower percentages for the modulation amount, so we can create something a bit more subtle, as what we have now is quite extreme. Let's move the first two to around 20%. And let's move the last one to around 10%. Okay, let's now hear this back, and you should hear the modulation is more subtle than what we had previously. Of course, we have all the other things we can modulate in the synth as well that we looked at previously. So we can modulate oscillator 1 shape, the 2 sources for the pitch modulation, 2 sources to modulate the filter frequency, and we can choose a modulation source for the LFO amount. This synth really does offer a lot of different modulation possibilities, but for now though, let's go back to the Modulation tab and set these all back to 0% before we look at the next area, which is the Voices section, which we'll be looking at in the next video. Okay, so now let's have a look at the Voices section for this Drift Synth. Let's first talk about the Voices mode. By default, and what we've been using so far, is the poly or polyphonic voices mode. With this mode, we can play more than one note at a time. So this is useful for playing chords or more than one note at the same time. We can also set the maximum amount of voices down here. I'd normally leave this on 32 unless your CPU is spiking. If your computer power is struggling, then you could lower this to save on CPU, but depending on your part, you may need more voices. 16 or 8 is probably fine when using poly mode, but some of the voices modes will use up more than one voice per note, but I'll be talking about this soon enough. Let's have a look at the next voices mode, which is mono or monophonic. This means we can only play one note at a time. So this might be suitable for bass parts or lead parts where the part is playing only one note at a time. When we switch this to the mono mode, we also have these other settings that we can use too, including monothickness, legato, and glide. So monothickness will essentially add some sub-oscillators to your part to make it sound thicker. Let me show you now. So if I increase this to 100% and then compare it to 0%, you should hear that 100% should sound much thicker. Let's put the monothickness back to 100%, and let's now put the drift control to 100% and hear the difference. So I think this can sound interesting when we increase the drift amount as well. We also can turn on the legato control down here. When legato is enabled, when we trigger a new voice, it won't re-trigger the envelopes. So you can hear this can give us a different kind of sound as well. Then we can add some glide between the notes by adding some glide time. So this is with the glide at 0 milliseconds. And let's now increase the glide time. And let's now increase this a bit more. But for now, let's put glide back to the default of 0 milliseconds. And let's disable legato and have a look at the next voices mode. So next we have the stereo mode, and this will spread the voices across the stereo field. We can increase the stereo spread with this percentage control here, and this will move the sound across the stereo field. If you're listening on headphones or studio monitors, then you should be able to hear the stereo spread. Let's also hear this with drift at 0%. So when we increase the stereo spread, we're adding slight variations to the sound across the left and right speaker. So when we increase this, it allows us to get a wider sound. With high drift amounts as well, you should hear it sounds different on the left and right channels. Okay, so now let's have a look at the next mode, which is the unison mode. This mode will use 4 voices per note, so you may need a higher voice amount to play back chords. For example, if I set the voices to 4 and try and play a chord, you'll notice it's only going to play back one note at a time. So for a 4-note chord, you'll need to set this to 16, and if you want more than 4 notes in your chord, then you'll need to set this to 32. As I said, I normally just leave the voices on 32, unless it's spiking my CPU, but if your computer is struggling, then you may need to adjust the number of voices. So as unison is playing back 4 voices, it'll detune each note slightly so that they'll sound different. So this mode can be useful for making big fat unison sounds. So this could be useful for making a big sounding bass line, for example. This mode also sounds interesting with high drift amounts. But for now, let's put the drift back to default. We also have the strength control for the unison voice. This allows you to set how much pitch variation is applied to each of the different voices. And now let's try this with a high drift amount. Okay, so that's the different modes for the voices. And then on the right of the synth, we have a few more controls. We have the master volume for the synth. So for example, if you're pushing the gain of the oscillators quite high and you want to keep them at this level, then you may wish to turn down the master volume for the synth so it doesn't clip the channel. Or you can increase the master volume if you want the synth to be louder. Below this, we have the velocity volume control. This control allows us to set how much volume will be modulated by the MIDI note velocity. If this is at 0%, then the velocity of the notes won't affect the volume output. So now I'm going to play soft and then hard. And you can hear the playback with the same velocity. If this is at 100%, then it will be very noticeable. Again, I'm going to play back the same note, soft and then hard. However, I'd normally leave this around 50%. Then we have the transpose control. With this, we can transpose the synth in semitones. We could transpose this in octaves too if we wish. So maybe down 1 octave, or up 1 octave. This goes all the way to plus 48, so up 4 octaves, and all the way down to minus 48 or down 4 octaves. Then we have note pitch bend, and this is only relevant for MPE controllers. If this is enabled, then it means the pitch will change based on your finger position. And if it's disabled or turned off, then the pitch won't change based on your finger position. Then finally, we have the pitch bend range control. With this, we can change the pitch bend range in semitones. So if I play a note on my MIDI keyboard and adjust the pitch bend range, you should notice the note is bending 2 semitones. However, let's now increase this to 12, so now we can bend the note up to 1 octave. This can be useful if you want to add some pitch bend range to your notes and your MIDI device has a control that allows you to bend the pitch, such as a pitch bend wheel. Okay, so that's the end of this video. We've looked at all the different controls for the voices section. Okay, so now I've taught you all the different functions and features in this Drift synthesizer. Now let's have a quick look at some of the presets for this Drift synth. Presets can be a great way to get inspiration for a sound, and looking at how the different settings and parameters change between the different presets can be a useful way to help you understand the synth. Okay, so now let's have a look at a few of these. If you don't have the exact presets as me, or if any of them have been updated or changed in the future, don't worry, you should be able to download more packs that include presets from the official Ableton site, or you can head over to packs and then go down to available packs in your browser to download some more packs and presets. We can actually click to preview some of these sounds, but as I said, it can be quite useful to actually open up the device and have a look at the different settings of the synth. So let's have a look at this one here. And some of these will be instrument racks. If you hit this button here, this will show the device. Let's now have a look at some pads. And let's have a look at some synth leads. So the synth does come with a lot of different presets, and I do recommend testing out some of these. Okay, so we're now at the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you found it useful. This video is actually a section taken from my complete Ableton Live course. If you'd like to learn even more about music production in Ableton Live, then be sure to check out this complete course via the link in the description below. So thanks again for watching, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one.